So, hi everyone out there all over the world, and many thanks to Rock Blue for inviting me to make this presentation, which I hope will help all of you out there prepare for the issues that you may meet with COVID-19, as well as teaching you skills which can be applied to other emergencies or any other unplanned experiences. And it will also allow you to prepare an emergency response plan, which can be used to develop a budget for funding agencies. And I would like to say that Rock Blue has been working with a number of African water utilities, helping them prepare emergency response plans. And we can supply sample documentation and give you support if you haven't done anything like this before or aren't sure how COVID-19 may affect you. So sometimes you hear about emergency planning, and also you may hear about the issue of business continuity. So what's the difference? Well, emergency planning is really focusing on the risks you're likely to meet in anything unexpected, and what you will do in response to manage those risks. Business continuity focuses on the business and allows you to think about what are the critical parts of the business and how can you ensure that they will continue whatever gets thrown at them. This presentation will really cover both because for COVID-19, you need to think about both. Now, this diagram is a good summary of the stages you need to go through. It comes from a British standard on crisis management, and that document is available if anyone would like a copy. And the initial stage is anticipating and assessing, and it may be that you don't have much time for that. Some of you will already be, for instance, in lockdown, so you may already be having to prepare for what you need to change in order to deal with COVID-19. And in fact, you may already, in some cases, be into the third stage of response and actually dealing with issues. But take heart, there will be a time when you are looking for recovery and taking stock and moving back into more normal activities. And at that time, you need to review and learn what you went through. So for COVID-19, if we look at this, what you can do to assess is collect information. For instance, what will be the impact? Back in the UK, at the start of the pandemic, there were all sorts of ideas being circulated about what would protect you from COVID-19 contamination. And a lot of those were just untrue. So actually, ensuring that you collect the correct information and identify how that will have an impact on your operations is really important. You may want to be collecting contacts and communication lines. Maybe you know these, but are they written down? Because the person who knows the right contact in a key supplier may not be available when you need to contact that supplier. So you've got to be prepared and you've got to be proactive, which brings us to the next stage, which is about preparing and particularly getting the emergency response plan written down. But you can also brief staff, develop more detailed plans, collect equipment. And then when you're actually dealing with the issues that COVID-19 has sent, then you implement what you've written down. And it's important, rather than to have a knee-jerk reaction, to keep referring back to that plan. It may be that some things don't turn out as you expect. And, you know, we're all facing uncertainty. It may be worse or better than you think. So you need to adjust, and you need to think, how can you minimize the impact? But as I said, it will finish. And therefore, you need to identify what triggers will allow de-escalation. Will they come from the government? Will they come from local government? Will they come from a health advisor? And then how can you return to whatever normal was as quickly as possible? And then finally, an important phase that so often gets forgotten, learn. There will be all sorts of lessons you'll look back at, and you can actually look at how you can apply those to other problems, and maybe even gain ideas of how you can work more efficiently in the future. So what are likely to be the possible impacts of COVID? And I'm basing this on a lot of experience from UK, US, and a number of overseas organizations. There have been WhatsApp groups that are sharing experience. So first off, you need to minimize the risk of infection to all your staff. You may have some key workers sick, and some workers will have to work from home. I know some African countries have already applied lockdown regulations. And so key workers may be isolated. They may need to care for their family members. There may be government rules, and there may be a lack of transport for them to get to their places of work, which could leave remaining staff who are less affected overworked, dealing with too much, and overtired. Other things they may have to face. Well, you may need to be involved in minimizing risk to customers. That's both to those coming to the offices, but also ensuring that that critical item, clean water for hand washing, is available for everyone. Suppliers may have problems. Now, I know some of you have to deal with supply problems all the time, but they could get worse. And then customer payments may cause difficulties. In the UK, cash is now pretty well a no-no, because if you handle money, then you can transfer virus through the notes to someone else. Reading meters may not be possible. Customers may not be able to pay if they are not able to go to work themselves. And commercial customers may have to close down their plants. For instance, in the UK, cafes, bars, anything to do with hospitality, that's all been closed. And so they are not consuming any water, which means they may well not be paying their normal charges. There may be chances in demand patterns. Commercial areas, the demand may drop, but you could see a surge in demands in domestic areas. And that certainly happened in the UK, where we were unlucky enough to coincide with very hot spell, which certainly challenged water utilities. And so there may be shortages of water for all sorts of reasons. One might be demand, a lot of more hand washing, but also it might be due to failures in other things, such as electricity or diesel. And there may be other impacts that you can think of locally. So as far as risk to staff goes, communication is critical. I cannot emphasize this. They will be wondering what the hell is going to happen to them. They will be worried. They will be concerned. So you need to keep the communication going, because stressed staff do not do such a good work. Now, the good news is that water is a key activity, and most governments and local government will recognize this. If they don't, then one of the jobs of senior staff is to make sure that message is conveyed. If you are already on lockdown, or if any staff are likely to be on lockdown now, you need to think about when offices open. Even when people are allowed to go to work, you may need to change how people work. And you may need to change the layout of offices. You may need to move desks, provide barriers, simple things like sticking a rope up the middle of a staircase so that people go up on one side and down on the other. Hand washing facilities may need to be improved. It may be a simple thing like a large water container, a bowl, and some soap. But you need to make sure everyone has access to that. There's a lot of people saying, oh, we need PPE, we can't work without PPE. Yes, it will help, but in a lot of cases, it actually makes no difference. And for instance, for people working outside, they may not require any additional PPE if they can be distanced from other people. And Peter Macy passed on a saying, which I think it really sums it up. The most important protection will come from water and soap. It's simple, and because it's so simple, people often overlook it, but that does make your role critical. Outside of work, you need to think about your staff. If they're working from home, can their productivity be maintained? In the UK, schools have been closed, and a lot of people I know well, colleagues of mine, have said they found it really difficult because they've had to look after the children and try and work as well. And if they're at home, you can't manage their outputs by watching them. You've got to set targets and make sure they meet them. And you may find it difficult to motivate them. When they're sitting at home, they may be looking around and thinking of all those other odd jobs they need to do, or the kids may be screaming or whatever. And then how will you keep in touch with them and communicate with them? If they are going into work, how are they going to get into work? Transport in a lot of cities requires sitting in crowded minibuses, which will be an absolute gift for the COVID virus. So you may need to think about providing transport. And you need to think about their families as well, because it's no good making sure your staff are safe if they just pick up infection when they're at home. So families need to be thinking about self-isolation. If members of the family are working in the health industry, for instance, they may be at a higher risk of getting contaminated. And something which people often forget, shopping will become a risky occupation. You can pick up COVID by just touching goods which other people who have the infection have touched before you. So if your key workers are sick or isolated at home for whatever reason, you need to think about what are the critical activities. So what must keep going come what may? It may well be things like water treatment operations, pumping, key repairs, but other things could possibly be deferred. Meter reading, it may be possible you can base billing on past meter readings. Cleaning or maintenance may be able to be deferred, and new construction and some repairs may be able to wait. And if you think about who are the critical workers carrying out those critical activities, how will you cover for them? What are their skills? What are their knowledge? And if you need to write down anything, procedures, information about where to find documents and that sort of thing, document now whilst they're still at work. It's a chance to update or write from scratch manuals and standard operating procedures. So it's really useful to do that. And the other thing that you can do is build up a table of the key activity, who normally does it, what other staff could do that if necessary. It might be their line manager who was promoted recently enough they can remember how to do a manual job. And then you may need to say, what resource do the, if you like, the deputies or the stand-ins require in order to be able to cover that activity. So you may need to train staff, and whatever actions you need to do, as I said, do them now, because you may need your skilled and experienced staff to train other people. I mentioned that if you've got some staff away for whatever reason, make sure they don't get tired. And so build in some relief at all levels. And I've said it including yourselves, because I've managed all sorts of emergencies in water utilities. And when you're in the middle of emergency, the last thing you think about is sort of taking time out, and you often feel, well, I can't because I'm in charge. Make sure you identify cover for yourselves as well, because if you get tired, you might start making mistakes, and that's no good for anyone. Other things you can do for staff welfare, it might be useful to arrange temporary accommodation so that they don't have to travel back home and face infection from friends and family. I mentioned shopping is risky, so you might want to provide some meals for people. Although do think about those communal areas, canteens, restaurants, that sort of thing. They can be a source of contamination. So you need to decide, will you keep them open? If you keep them open, will you change the layout? Or do you need to close them for everyone's safety? I mentioned about shopping being a risk. Customers paying can provide a risk. And if they handle cash, that can transfer a virus. So you need to think about cashless payments. Arrange for people to make bank transfers, card payments. There are subcontractors out there who can take over this whole service. Have a look at them now if you think that that will help. And you will need to then communicate to customers what the payment arrangements will be, because they may not be used to using bank transfers or card payments. Same applies for suppliers. What are they doing? How are they making sure that those critical supplies, such as chlorine, such as treatment chemicals, will continue to be available? And can you arrange alternative supplies if, for instance, companies are having problems delivering? Have you got vehicles that can collect? And the other thing is, you will need to have the accounting department look at the cash flow, because if customers can't pay, you need to work out how you can continue to provide the service. And you may be called upon to assist generally with minimizing rates of infection. I've talked about water being essential. So if you are talking about hygiene, you may want to include things which you wouldn't normally include, about the use of soap and contamination, or have a part in government communication. And there may be locations where there isn't a water connection to every property, or even communal taps. The communal taps need to be managed to keep people apart. And if water availability is an issue, then it may be you will be called upon to provide bowsers, water tanks, temporary water containers of whatever sort, to make sure that people can wash their hands. So once you've gone through all these things, you need to write down the contingency measures. Don't overcomplicate with things, but that needs to be communicated to staff. And you need to do it in such a way that you reassure them that you are in control, rather than, oh my God, this is going to be awful. Oh, you know, how are we going to cope? You've got to calm people down. They will be worried. If people are going to be away, there may be different lines of management. How do people manage when they take a few days off, or when they're off sick due to all sorts of other reasons? The people being away isn't unusual. What will be unusual is possibly the numbers of them all at the same time. You need to think about all the different ways of communicating, And then finally, which will be something which the other two presenters will look at in more detail, is what will it cost? Go through all the requirements, but if you're putting together a cost profile, you need to explain what assumptions you made. So if you say, well, we're going to need extra overtime, well, how much overtime? Why do you need that overtime? Is it to work on the documentation, or is it because you're already short of people and having to pay people overtime to cover to them? Don't go for nice to haves. It might be great to have to replace physical visits or inspections with CCTV. But if you can't manage the procurement process within the time required, then it's not going to be a lot of help, and it will just undermine the veracity of your assumptions and of your financial plan. So these are some of the documents which you might need to think about in advance. So where can you get information for all sorts of things? Standard agendas. You may want a weekly update from everyone. What questions will you ask? You want to document when you can relax, for instance. I mentioned roles and responsibilities. You may want to issue statements to customers. You may have problems of water supply, so you need to have all that available. You may want a list of all the items you're going to hand to people. And you may want to have a list of who will speak to press or design social media messages. So that leads on nicely to communication, which will be critical. There are all sorts of ways you can communicate, but before you do, you need to think, what are the key messages? People will have all sorts of information being thrown at them from all directions. So you need to be concise. And it may be that the other communication channels have problems. If a telecoms company hasn't done their emergency planning properly, maybe the telecommunication systems won't work. And you need to ensure that the messages are appropriate for the different levels. And you will be thinking, for instance, how do you give information to the key decision makers in government, in the local council, that sort of thing. And also listen to the staff. They do this job every day. It's just now it might be a bit more complicated, but they may well have ideas that you can use to help you. So with implementation, keep calm, just address each problem as it arises. You need to identify an overall incident manager and a team below that manager to help. And an important thing, someone who will collate all the documents. Hold regular briefings because you want to be able to keep up to date. And it's better just to have a quick phone round or a WhatsApp group that says, yeah, everything's fine, than not have that set up and leave someone struggling. This will go on for some time. Interestingly enough, lockdown in the UK started on March the 23rd. On that day, no one who was not in an essential role was allowed to go to work. And everything just stopped for 1 month. Gradually things are opening, but it's still far from normal. A lot of people aren't going into work. And so it will go on for a while. And you won't get everything right, I'm afraid. I never did. So accept that now. Don't angst over it and just learn. Update the plans as and when you can. Things may change. As I mentioned, you'll make mistakes. Other people may. Note those down and ask everyone to keep a note of what they've learned from this and things that could be better, because that can be collated into a really useful document. I've said it will be over, and you need to think about that time as well. Have brainstorm to think about what went well, because I'm sure there'll be things that are managed really well, but there will be other things that you think, well, could have been better. And write this up as a report. That report could gain you future funding if you show that you were in control and managed it to the best of your ability. It's a really vital document. And don't forget to say thank you to everyone who went above and beyond, because I'm sure there will be some. And you can actually gain some things from this. You may identify better ways of working. Maybe some people can work from home, or you can do more remote ways. All those changes in how people pay may be a permanent change. It will help you with other emergency planning. And I've mentioned it will demonstrate you can manage things. And it may help build the overall team spirit of your organization. So that's all I have to say, and I would wish you all
days, we've
best
gone
luck.
from 50,000 to 100,000 cases in the past 2 weeks.
Thank you, Joe. That was absolutely great. We've got a couple of questions from our participants. The first one has to do with the idea of, you talked about employee tracking and monitoring of the other workers, but what about either contractors or outsourced operations? How do you monitor and how do you manage that larger workforce that might not be under your direct control?
Well, I think this goes under the heading of suppliers. So if they're contractors, you need to contact them and ask them how they are going to be managing their operations under COVID. So say it's a repair contractor, they may not be able to work in the same number of teams as they had, because that might introduce contamination, infection risk. So you need to ask them how they will work. As ever, with a contractor, it's up to them to deliver the requirements of the contract. It may be you need to check the contract to see whether some exceptional circumstances cover pandemic. So that's not a bad thing to do in preparation, because they might be coming to you and claiming additional costs, and you need to have an answer ready. But the main thing is to talk to them and treat them as a valuable ally rather than someone who will be taking you to the cleaners afterwards, and so setting up some barriers at this stage.
We did, as you know, we did.
Joe, on another subject, you talked about the idea of going to cashless transactions. As I'm sure you know, especially here in Africa and where we've worked across Asia and the like, cash is the preferred form or the only form of financial transaction. Do you have a sense for how long the virus, or what's the risk there, and how can that be better managed?
Well, even with cash transactions, they are still there occasionally. So you could, for instance, ask people to pay cash and have something that can wipe the cash down, or give people gloves, or just tell them, after every so many transactions, they must wash their hands, have a bowl, soap there, and that they must not touch another part of their body in between those hand washing. So if you really must use cash, you need to think about how to minimize contamination. But as I mentioned, there are actually contractors who are working in parts of Africa who will take on the collection of water charges, and it might be an occasion to investigate these and see if they can take it on. Obviously, they have the issue too, but it might be one way to avoid having too much to think about and too much to change all at once.
Anything from our donor.
Thanks, Jen. Finally, our final question today thus far, and I would like to extend the invitation to all of our participants to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Following the next presentations, we will wrap up today's lecture series with a larger panel discussion with all of our presenters. So please use that to interact with us. We encourage you to be engaged with this. Leading into the final question for Joe at this point, one of our participants, our friend Bado, says that COVID-19 requires, quote, deep cleaning of facilities where where an infection has been identified or has occurred. But in our line of work, many of these facilities need to operate 24/7. So what kind of protocols would you recommend in terms of incident management after a case has been detected?
Well, I would say prevention is the best form of cure. So if you can prevent that occurring, do by very rigorous procedures. If people can get hold of thermometers, you can get ones that read remotely if they're just pointed at your forehead. And certainly I've been to a couple of offices in the early days where my temperature was taken before I was allowed in. And so that's one thing to do. Rigorous communication to tell people that if they have any symptoms, they must not attend work. And just keep drumming that in. It's possibly better to have people worried unnecessarily. Okay, managers might not agree with me, but the alternative of the deep clean and removing all contamination is quite onerous. The other thing is to go through with your emergency plan, and for each office, do a what if. Okay, how will we carry out a deep clean? What will we have to shut down? What are the implications? If it means a break in continuity of supply, then what do you do? How do you communicate? So it's really thinking through what will happen and how you manage that. Having the staff on site who can do the deep clean as quickly as possible, or contractors, having those all lined up, and just really thinking everything through in advance.
Thanks, Joe. And I had said that was the last question, but I've got a really interesting one that's just come through. And it has to do with the idea of the onerous procurement processes in the face of an emergency. So, you talk about bringing in subcontractors to handle your payment systems or something like that, where you need somebody to come in and do a deep clean. But many of these utilities and municipalities are faced with very long procurement processes. What has been your experience with emergency or alternative procurement in the face of COVID?
Well, it may be that it's a judgment call. It may be that you can speed procurement up without necessarily bypassing them. So you could still call for tender, but have a shorter tender period than is usual, have people there to assess the tender all lined up so you get that done, so you fast track it. And particularly, you communicate with the decision makers, because often things can sit on, I don't know, the committee chairman's desk for the finance committee of municipal council or something like that. So this is where communication in advance of time to prepare people and make them aware. And it may be, whereas normally, it would go into the internal post or whatever, that someone goes down there, camps outside the decision maker's office, sticks it in front of them, keeping 2 meters apart, of course, and tells them how critical this particular decision is. In some cases, there will be procedures for agreeing things like single tender. So make sure that people are informed of that, and that if you have to develop a strong argument to go for a single tender, that is clear and concise and can stand up to arguments. So these things can be fast-tracked. But there has to be a will from everyone involved, and there will need to be some leadership, and some of people out there will need to show that leadership. I'm not saying it will be easy, but these are things where you can identify ways in which you can work, which will facilitate the decision making. But I don't necessarily have an easy answer.
Thanks, Joe. And I'll ask you to, as we go into the next presentations, to stay online until the end for a Q&A session, and all of our participants to please ask any questions using the Q&A tab, and we'll address them all at the end of the session.